Hello, welcome to the channel. Today, you will discover an emotional and mysterious story that took place in the village of St. Peter. A quiet funeral was interrupted by a loyal dog, leading to a series of events that revealed dark and surprising secrets. It's a tale of courage, loyalty, and justice that promises to stir your emotions. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the notification bell to receive our upcoming stories, and comment here from which city you are watching us. Your participation helps YouTube recommend our content, and together, we can bring these incredible stories to more people. The gray fog enveloped St. Peter's village, like a silent mourning that lingered over every roof and corner of the small community. The heavy atmosphere intensified as the townsfolk gathered in the small chapel for Hannah's funeral. The simple lightwood coffin rested under the dim light filtering through the dusty windows, bringing a sense of sadness and reverence. The faces of those present were marked by grief, and nervous whispers rippled through the crowd. Duke, Hannah's faithful dog, remained by the coffin, his eyes expressing unwavering loyalty. He barked incessantly, a sharp sound that pierced the heavy silence, as if trying to draw everyone's attention to the injustice of his loss. The dog's lament seemed to echo the anguish of the townspeople. "Be quiet, Duke. It's time to honor her memory," one of the attendees shouted, but the dog remained undeterred, continuing to bark, as if he knew something no one else did. David, a traveler passing through the village, observed the scene from a distance, intrigued by the intensity of the pain enveloping everyone. He had never known Hannah, but Duke's despair and the townsfolk's unease piqued his curiosity. "What happened here?" he muttered to himself, crossing his arms and feeling the humidity in the air. The scene seemed laden with secrets, and he sensed that there was more behind that tragic death than mere loss. After the funeral, the townspeople began to disperse, each carrying their own sorrow. David spotted Duke, who, amidst the crowd, appeared lost and disoriented. The dog looked at David, and for a moment, their expressions met. "You know something, don't you, boy?" David crouched down, extending his hand toward Duke, who immediately approached, wagging his tail as if recognizing an ally. "Let's find out what happened to your owner." Instinctively, Duke began to move, leading David toward Hannah's house. The traveler followed, intrigued by the dog's determination. The house, an old structure worn by time, had an air of abandonment, but the door stood ajar, as if inviting David to enter. "What are you showing me?" he asked as he crossed the threshold. Inside, the air was heavy, laden with memories. The living room displayed photos of Hannah and her friends, smiles that now seemed so distant. David felt a lump form in his throat as he imagined the loss that this house had endured. Duke, on the other hand, appeared to be searching for something, his restless behavior prompting David to follow the dog through the dusty rooms. "Duke, what are you looking for?" David asked. But the dog didn't respond, continuing its search. He then noticed a glimmer on the floor, something shining under the weak light. It was a key, an object that seemed out of place. "Did you find something?" David bent down to pick up the key, and as he did, he saw Duke run toward a door at the back of the house. With a mix of curiosity and caution, David followed Duke, who stopped in front of the closed door, looking at David with an expression that seemed to plead for help. "Let's see what's inside," David said, feeling adrenaline coursing through his body. He inserted the key into the lock, and with a click, the door swung open, revealing a space that appeared to have been forgotten by time. The atmosphere was thick, as if the very place were holding secrets. David stepped inside, and as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized that the search for answers was just beginning. David entered Hannah's house, feeling the heavy atmosphere that lingered over the place. The smell of the funeral was still fresh in the air, mingled with the faint aroma of flowers wilting in a vase on the table in the living room. The house, once filled with life and laughter, now felt like an echo of lost memories. As he looked around, he realized that each object told a story, but his gaze was drawn to a corner of the room where a wooden box rested on a dusty shelf. As he approached, David noticed that the box was slightly open, as if someone had tried but failed to close it completely. With a hesitant movement, he opened it and found a collection of yellowed letters and a leather-bound diary. The diary was more worn, its pages yellowed and some dog-eared, as if they had been quickly flipped through in search of answers. While examining the letters, David read aloud. Hannah, you need to be careful. Reverend Michael is not who he seems. I feel like he is watching you. His heart raced as he realized the words were a clear warning. He continued to flip through the diary's pages and found an entry that intrigued him. I can't stay here any longer. What he is doing with the church donations is wrong. I need to find out the truth, but I'm afraid. Duke, come here, boy, David called, and Hannah's dog, who had entered the house with him, approached with his tail wagging slightly. What do you think about this? David asked, pointing to the diary in his hands. Duke looked at him with his expressive eyes, as if he understood that something was amiss. David decided he needed more information, so he walked to the kitchen, where he found Clara, Hannah's best friend, sitting in a chair, wrapped in a mantle of sadness. She looked up at him, her eyes full of tears that glistened in the soft light streaming through the window. Did you find anything? She asked hesitantly, wiping away a tear that had rolled down her cheek. I found some letters and Hannah's diary. She mentioned being afraid of Reverend Michael, David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Did you know something was wrong? Clara sighed, staring at the floor with sorrow. I always suspected, but I had no proof. The Reverend was always kind to us, but there was something about the way he handled donations that made me uneasy. I should have said something, but I didn't know how. We need to act now, David said, determined. Hannah must have found something that made her fear for her life. We need to uncover the truth and protect what's left of her. Clara hesitated, but there was a spark of determination in her eyes. You're right. Let me see what you found. David handed her the diary. Clara began to flip through the pages, and a look of horror crossed her face as she read the notes about a hidden safe in the church. She knew. We need to go there and check it out. If the Reverend is embezzling donations, it explains a lot. Let's go then, David said, taking Clara's hand and gently pulling her along. Duke, lead the way, he commanded the dog, who immediately perked up and began walking toward the door, as if he understood there was a mission to fulfill. As they walked outside, David felt the adrenaline surge. With each step they took, his determination grew. He glanced at Clara, who looked nervous yet resolute at the same time. Are you sure you want to do this? He asked, trying to ensure she was ready. Yes, she replied, her voice firm. Hannah was my friend, and I can't let the Reverend do this to anyone else. We will find out the truth. Duke, ahead of them, started to run as if guiding them, and David and Clara followed, aware that they were about to uncover a mystery that could change everything in the small community of St. Peter's Village. David sat at a table in the small local diner, the smell of home-cooked food enveloping the atmosphere, but his mind was far from the comforting aroma. He gazed out the window, watching the residents of St. Peter's Village, whose sadness hung in the air like a fog. Hannah's death had left a deep mark on the community, and Duke, the loyal dog of the deceased, only intensified the feeling that something more was going on. Clara entered the diner, her reddened and swollen eyes revealing the tears she had tried to hold back. Upon spotting David, she hesitated for a moment but then approached, pulling out a chair to sit across from him. I don't know why I'm here, she said, her voice choked. I should be home mourning, but something tells me we need to talk. David nodded. I feel that way too. Duke wouldn't stop barking during the funeral. He knew something was wrong. He hesitated briefly, remembering the letters and the diary he had found at Hannah's house. I found some things in her house, letters that talk about a fear she had of Reverend Michael. Clara frowned, her eyes widening. The Reverend, I always thought he was odd, but Hannah never talked about it openly. What else did you find? David took a deep breath and pulled the diary from his backpack. She mentioned a hidden safe in the church. It seems donations were being embezzled, and she was on the verge of discovering something much bigger. Clara, we need to investigate this. I don't know, David. The Reverend is a respected figure here. If we say anything, I might cause more problems for myself and for Hannah, or worse. Clara looked down, her hands trembling slightly. I understand your fear, but Hannah isn't here anymore to help us. We need to do this for her. He leaned forward, his determination evident. If the Reverend is involved, he might have silenced her. We can't let this go unpunished. Clara hesitated, but the strength in David's words began to penetrate her resistance. Do you really think he could have done something like that? Fear and disbelief mingled in her gaze. I don't know, but we need to find out the truth. You were her best friend. If there's anything you know, anything at all, now is the time to speak up. She took a deep breath, her mind wrestling with memories of Hannah. She always had a feeling that something was wrong. Sometimes she talked about feeling watched, but I never thought it was serious. Maybe she discovered something she shouldn't have. David watched her, realizing Clara's hesitation was beginning to fade. Let's go to the church. Duke can help us find the safe. If we can get the proof, we can confront Reverend Michael. I don't know, David. What if he catches us? Clara whispered, fear reflected in her face. We have to take the risk. If what Hannah wrote is true, then we have no choice. And if Duke is acting strangely, maybe he knows something we don't. David stood up, resolute. Come on, Clara. Together, we are stronger. Clara looked at David, the determination in his eyes encouraging her. She slowly got up, still hesitant, but a spark of courage began to shine within her. Okay. If we're going to do this, we need to be careful. Without further ado, the two of them left the diner and headed toward the church. Duke, waiting outside, began to pull on the leash, leading them toward the place that would become the center of their discoveries. The tension in the air was palpable, but David and Clara's determination grew stronger with every step. They were about to unravel a mystery that could change the life of St. Peter's Village forever. David and Clara followed Duke, who seemed to have a clear objective as he guided them through the dimness of the church. Hannah's faithful dog was on high alert, his body tense as he stopped in front of an old, weathered door. The surrounding environment was shrouded in shadows, and the light streaming through the tall windows seemed to refuse to illuminate the darkest corners. David exchanged a meaningful glance with Clara, who displayed a mix of fear and determination. Do you think there's something in there? Clara asked quietly, her tone heavy with anticipation. I don't know, but I can't ignore what Duke is trying to show us. Let's find out, David replied, carefully opening the door. The creaking wood echoed through the church, making Clara shiver. Inside, the air was even heavier, filled with the scent of mold and dust. The dim light from David's flashlight revealed a small room cluttered with old, dusty objects. As they explored, Duke began to bark, running toward a wall that appeared unremarkable. He stopped in front of a simple altar, where a wooden cross was hanging. Why is he so focused here? Clara murmured, eyeing the cross with suspicion. Maybe there's something hidden, David suggested, moving closer to the cross. Let's check it out. He gently pulled the cross, and the wood moved, revealing a small opening behind it. David's heart raced at the possibility that they might have found something significant. Look at this, he said, forcing the entrance. With some effort, the section of the wall shifted, revealing a hidden safe. It was an old, worn safe with a lock mechanism that appeared stuck. David crouched down to examine it more closely. Do you think we can open it? Clara asked, her gaze fixed on the safe. We should try, David replied, attempting to turn the lock with his fingers. If the Reverend really diverted money from the donations, this could be the proof we need. As David focused on the lock, Duke's barking intensified, as if the dog knew the importance of what was about to be revealed. Duke, calm down, Clara said, stroking the dog's fur. We're almost there. After several frustrating minutes, a click echoed as David finally managed to open the safe. He lifted the lid, and upon looking inside, his eyes widened in shock. Oh my God, Clara, look at this. Inside the safe were stacks of cash, along with yellowed documents. David picked up one of the papers and began to examine it. These are donation lists, and there are signatures here. It's all from Reverend Michael. His voice was filled with disbelief. Clara approached, her eyes shining with a mix of excitement and fear. This is huge, David. If we can prove that he diverted this, we can put an end to what he's doing. Yes, David agreed, holding the documents tightly. But we have to be careful. He could find out we're here at any moment. As they examined the contents of the safe, a sudden noise made them freeze. Heavy footsteps echoed from the church corridor, and David looked at Clara, his heart racing. We need to hide, he whispered, quickly pushing Duke into a dark corner of the room. Clara nodded. her wide eyes fixed on the stack of boxes as they squeezed behind them. The sound of approaching footsteps drew closer, and fear hung thick in the air. David could smell the aged wood mixed with the cold sweat trickling down his forehead. Reverend Michael was getting nearer, and they couldn't be discovered. "If he catches us with this, everything will be lost," Clara murmured, her voice barely audible. "We can't let that happen." "We have to act fast," David whispered back, his mind racing with thoughts of how they could escape without being seen. Their hearts pounded as the tension in the room grew, and they hoped the Reverend wouldn't find them. David and Clara, hidden in the church's shadows, remained utterly silent. David's heart pounded, and he felt adrenaline coursing through his veins as they tried to discern what was happening above them. The echoes of heavy footsteps reverberated on the stone floor, and the tension in the air increased with every passing second. Clara, beside him, looked so pale that her features almost blended into the shadows. "Do you think he knows we're here?" Clara whispered, her eyes wide, fixed on the cellar door. "I don't know," David replied quietly. "But we need to find out what he's planning." The murmurs became clearer, and David craned his neck to listen more closely. Reverend Michael's voice was deep and threatening. "We can't let her talk. Hannah has to be silenced before she finds out everything. If she opens her mouth, we're all going to jail." Clara shuddered at the mention of Hannah. "He's talking about her," she said, almost in a whisper, her hands clenching into fists. "We need to do something," David asserted, determination growing within him. "But we can't act until we know she's safe." "And if he finds her?" Clara questioned, her eyes filled with worry. "We have to be quick. We're closer than ever, Clara. Duke can help us." David looked at the dog, who remained by their side, attentive and alert. "He seems to know what's happening. Let's trust his instincts." Before they could discuss further, the Reverend's footsteps faded away, giving the impression that he had left the basement. David and Clara seized the moment and emerged from their hiding place, careful not to make a sound. The smell of dampness and old wood enveloped them as they cautiously moved toward the staircase leading to the altar. "If he has a safe or something, it could be behind the cross," Clara suggested, pointing to a large wooden cross dominating the wall behind the altar. "It's a perfect place to hide something." "Let's check it out," David replied, and together they approached the cross, with Duke following closely. As they got nearer, David noticed a small opening at the base of the cross, almost invisible to the untrained eye. "It's here," he whispered, crouching down to examine it more closely. With Clara's help, they began to carefully move the cross, and to their surprise, it shifted easily, revealing a hidden compartment. "Wow, this is amazing," Clara said, her eyes sparkling with anticipation. "Let's see what's inside." David slipped into the space and found a small but sturdy safe hidden beneath a wooden panel. "This must be what we're looking for," he exclaimed, hope blossoming in his chest. "But how are we going to open it?" Clara asked, glancing around as if something might help them. "Let's try to force it open," David suggested, but before he could do anything, Duke began barking furiously, as if sensing something. "Duke, what's wrong?" Clara asked, anxious. The dog was agitated, looking toward the church door. "He senses that the Reverend could come back at any moment. We need to be quick," David warned, trying to open the safe. He was determined, but Clara's anxiety was starting to show. "David, please be careful." "I don't want him to catch us," Clara pleaded, her voice trembling. "I know, Clara. Just trust me," David said as he attempted to force the safe open. Finally, with one last push, he managed to open it. Inside was a stack of documents and a considerable amount of cash. "Look at this," he said as Clara leaned in to see the contents. "These documents, they're evidence," Clara exclaimed, her eyes wide as she saw what appeared to be records of embezzled donations. "This could incriminate the Reverend." "We need to take this and find a way to expose the truth," David asserted, but Duke's barking echoed through the space again, interrupting his thoughts. "We need to get out of here now," Clara said, urgency rising in her voice. "The Reverend could return any minute." David nodded, quickly stowing some documents in the backpack he carried. "Let's go, Duke," he called, and the dog positioned himself in front of them as if he knew exactly where to lead. Together, they braced themselves for what was to come, determined to uncover the truth and save Hannah before it was too late. David and Clara cautiously descended the hidden staircase, the cold stone walls seeming to absorb the light from their lanterns. The air was thick and damp, and the atmosphere was charged with tension and anticipation. Every step echoed like a distant memory, almost as if the church itself were holding its breath. Duke, the loyal dog, led the way, his tail nervously wagging as he guided the group through the shadows. "Do you think Hannah is really here?" Clara asked, her voice a trembling whisper, almost lost in the darkness. "I feel that she is," David replied, resolute. The letters in the diary made it clear that something terrible was happening. If Reverend Michael was really involved, I have no doubt he did something to silence her. They reached a small corridor, and Duke stopped abruptly in front of a worn wooden door. With a meaningful look, the dog glanced at David, and then at Clara, as if urging them to understand they were close. David exchanged a worried glance with Clara before pushing the door, which creaked open ominously. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint light from their lanterns. In the back of the room, a poorly lit corner revealed a figure chained up. David felt his heart race as he recognized the blonde hair and familiar features of Hannah. She was there, weak and pale, but alive. "Hannah!" David exclaimed, rushing toward her. Clara followed, tears in her eyes. "We're here. We're going to get you out of here." Hannah lifted her head, her expression of pain lighting up at the realization she was not alone. "David." "Clara?" Her voice was weak, barely a whisper, but filled with relief. "You came to save me." "Yes, we're here to take you home," Clara said, kneeling beside Hannah and examining the chains that bound her. "What happened? Who did this to you?" "It was the Reverend," Hannah replied, her voice choked. He didn't want me talking about what I discovered. He said I was threatening everything he built. I didn't want to believe him, but he locked me up here." David crouched down and began working on the chains holding Hannah, trying to stay calm, but adrenaline coursed through his veins. "Come on, just a bit more. We need to be quick. The Reverend could return at any moment." With one final pull, the chains came loose, and Hannah fell into Clara's arms, who hugged her tightly. "You're safe now. Let's get out of here," Clara murmured, her voice full of emotion. Hannah took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "I don't know if I can. I'm so weak," she said, her voice trembling. "You can do it," David insisted, already rising. "We need to hurry. Let's go before he realizes you're here." Hannah looked at Duke, who was by her side, with an expression of loyalty and protection. "Duke, you came to find me," she said, petting the dog's head. He barked softly, as if he understood the gravity of the situation. "Now let's move," David said, aiming for the exit. "Follow us, Hannah. We're in this together." As they began to move, David felt a wave of relief at having found Hannah, but the worry still hung in the air. Time was running out, and they needed a plan to escape. "How are we going to get out without being seen?" he questioned, looking at Clara. "Maybe we can use the back exit," Clara suggested, her gaze determined. "If we can make it there without being spotted, we can escape through the back door of the church." "Okay, then let's be careful," David said, urging everyone to move cautiously. Adrenaline coursed through their bodies, and the tension was palpable, but the hope of rescuing Hannah propelled them forward. As David and Clara hid behind some wooden crates in the church's basement, the tension in the air was thick. The sound of Reverend Michael's heavy footsteps echoed against the cold, damp walls, interrupted only by Duke's anxious barking as he kept watch at the entrance. David's heart raced. He knew every second counted. "We need to do something, David," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with fear. "He could find us here any moment." "Calm down, Clara," David replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to wait. If he comes in here, we might have a chance to catch him off guard." The basement door creaked open, and Reverend Michael stepped in, his robust figure casting a sinister shadow on the floor. He looked even more menacing in that dimly lit space, his eyes scanning the surroundings like a predator searching for its prey. David and Clara held their breath, huddling in the darkness, while Duke remained on high alert, his barks now quieter, but still full of determination. "Where are you, you wretched thing?" the Reverend shouted, his voice resonating with anger. "I know you're here. Don't think you can hide from me." David felt a chill run down his spine at the Reverend's words. He was clearly referring to Hannah. He cannot find out we found her, David thought, the weight of responsibility settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew he had to protect Hannah at all costs. We have to do something now, Clara insisted, her gaze fixed on David, hoping he had a plan. If he finds her before we can get out, I don't know what he'll do. I have an idea, David murmured, glancing at Duke, who was poised and alert to the Reverend. Let's distract him. Duke can do it. If anyone can grab his attention, it's Duke. David crouched down, looking into the dog's eyes. Duke, buddy, are you ready to help? The dog barked in response, as if understanding the importance of the moment. David and Clara positioned themselves, ready to act. When the Reverend turned, David signaled to Duke. The dog obediently dashed out of hiding and ran toward the Reverend, barking loudly and fiercely. Duke, no, David whispered, but it was too late. The Reverend spun around, startled by the sudden appearance of the dog. You? Michael shouted, furious, as he tried to swat Duke away with a harsh gesture. What are you doing here, you stupid animal? The dog did not back down. He continued to advance, defiantly barking and circling the Reverend, who, momentarily distracted, didn't notice that David and Clara were moving slowly. David gestured for Clara to follow, and together they approached the staircase leading out of the basement. Now, David whispered, and both began to climb carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. The Reverend, realizing what was happening, yelled, What are you doing? Come back here. David and Clara rushed toward the basement door, their hearts pounding rapidly. We need to confront him, Clara. We can't let him get away, David said, already determined to protect Hannah at all costs. You're right, Clara agreed, her determination growing. Let's end this now. David took a deep breath. I'll confront him. If he tries to harm you or Hannah, I won't hesitate. He felt a surge of courage and adrenaline, knowing this was the decisive moment. With one last look at Clara, he prepared to face the Reverend. It was time to act, and he wouldn't let fear stop him. David felt adrenaline coursing through his veins as he hid in the dark basement of the church, his breath heavy and uneven. Beside him, Clara held Hannah's hand, who was still weak and frightened, but her eyes sparkled with hope upon seeing David. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and despair, yet there, determination was growing. The sound of Reverend Michael's footsteps echoed on the stairs, and David knew time was running out. We need to act quickly, David whispered, looking at Clara. As soon as he comes in, I'll try to distract him. You and Hannah need to be ready to run. Clara nodded, her expression a mix of fear and courage. I'm with you. We can't let him hurt her any further. Hannah, still shackled, looked at David, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you for finding me. I don't know what I would do without you. We're going to get you out of here, I promise, David replied, his voice firm, even though his heart was racing. The Reverend's footsteps grew louder, closer, and the tension in the air was palpable. David could feel the sweat trickling down his forehead as he braced himself for the confrontation. He knew the Reverend was dangerous, but he couldn't let fear take over. Now, David whispered. He positioned himself in a corner, right by the stairs, as Clara moved to stand beside Hannah, ready to help her escape as soon as the opportunity arose. The door to the basement swung open abruptly, and Reverend Michael stormed in, his face twisted in a mix of anger and confusion. What are you doing here? He shouted, his voice echoing off the cold walls. Get out now, or you will face the consequences. David took a deep breath, his mind racing. You're not going to hurt anyone else, Reverend, he yelled, stepping out from his hiding place and facing the man with determination. And we know what you've done. The Reverend looked taken aback, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. You don't know what you're talking about, boy. You'd better leave before I decide to do something you'll regret. You're mistaken. I know exactly what I'm talking about. David shot back, taking a few steps forward. Hannah isn't the first victim of your greed and desperation. We're going to put an end to this now. The Reverend let out a sarcastic laugh, but there was a hint of nervousness in his tone. You think you can stop me? You're just a lost traveler. And then the tension snapped. David lunged forward, trying to subdue the Reverend. The struggle began, with David aiming a punch, but the Reverend dodged and shoved him aside, The basement echoed with the sounds of their clash, and the dim light made the scene even more dramatic. "David, watch out!" Clara shouted, watching as the Reverend struggled to shake off David. Duke, Hannah's loyal dog, who had been by their side, let out a fierce bark and charged at the Reverend. He jumped, biting the man's pant leg and distracting him long enough for David to land a solid blow, causing the Reverend to lose his balance. "This is what you get for hurting an innocent," David yelled, seizing the opportunity to shove the Reverend against the wall. The man stumbled and fell to his knees, his expression now a mix of surprise and anger. "Clara, help Hannah!" David shouted as he tried to keep the Reverend under control. Clara immediately rushed to Hannah, who was struggling to free herself from her chains. "Come on, Hannah, I'm going to help you," Clara said, searching for a way to release her. David glanced at them, and for a moment, he felt the urgency of the situation intensifying. "Hurry, Clara," he urged, refocusing on the Reverend, who was starting to regain his footing. Duke continued to growl, ready to assist his friend. "I got it," Clara exclaimed as she finally managed to remove the chains binding Hannah. "Now, let's get out of here." But before they could move, heavy footsteps echoed down the stairs again, and the tension thickened in the air. The atmosphere was charged, heavy with tension and anticipation, as David positioned himself in front of the crowd that had gathered around the church. He held in his hands the evidence he had found in the safe, documents that could finally bring to light the truth about Reverend Michael and the dark secrets surrounding the small community of St. Peter's Village. The townspeople, still reeling from recent events, looked at David with a mix of hope and skepticism. He took a deep breath and with a clear and firm voice, began to speak. "Everyone, I know this is hard to believe, but what we found in the church is proof that Hannah didn't die by accident. Reverend Michael is not who he appears to be." A murmur ran through the crowd. Clara, standing beside David, watched the neighbors' reactions with anxious eyes. She knew the revelation would be shocking, but she hoped the truth would be strong enough to unite the community around a common goal: justice. David continued, raising the letters and documents. "These papers show that the Reverend embezzled money from the church's donations. He was using it for his own purposes, and Hannah discovered everything. She was about to expose his actions, and that's why he tried to silence her." The murmurs grew louder, now turning into shouts of outrage. "How could he do this to one of our own?" A man in the crowd exclaimed. "She was always so good to all of us." Reverend Michael, who had remained silent until then, finally spoke up. His expression was one of disdain, as if this were just a common trick. "These documents are forgeries, a conspiracy designed to tarnish my name. This is all a lie. The truth is that Hannah was out of control and I was merely helping her find the right path." The crowd, however, didn't seem convinced. David stepped forward, holding the documents tightly. "These aren't just papers, Reverend. They show your embezzlement, and I have witnesses who can confirm the truth. You can't let your words, and which now sound empty, cover up what really happened." People exchanged glances, some showing expressions of doubt, others nodding in understanding. Clara, sensing the growing energy, decided to speak up. "I'm Hannah's friend. She told me about her fears regarding the Reverend. You can't keep deceiving us, Michael." Indignation swept through the group as the Reverend tried to maintain his composure. "You're being manipulated by a traveler. A stranger who just arrived in this village. How can you believe him instead of me, who has always been here serving God and you?" "Because we know the truth," a woman in the crowd shouted, and soon other voices joined her. "We know who you really are." David felt the energy of the crowd transform into a clamor for justice. He knew this was the decisive moment. "We cannot let lies prevail. We need to act now. Hannah deserves justice, and so do you. Let the truth reveal who the real criminal is here." The Reverend, realizing his position was becoming untenable, tried to use his authoritative tone. "You have no idea what you're doing. You're about to destroy the only thing you have, your faith in your leadership." The crowd, now furious, began to press in on the Reverend. "You are the true threat to our faith," a man shouted. "Get out of our sight." With the pressure mounting, the Reverend found himself surrounded, and his facade of control began to crumble. He realized the support he once had evaporated. David, sensing the strength of the collective, raised the documents once more. "We must call the authorities and ensure he can't hurt anyone else. This is the time for us to unite and fight for the truth." The crowd, now in unison, began to shout for justice, and the Reverend was met with disapproving stares. The atmosphere of rebellion and determination grew, and David knew the community was finally awakening to the reality hidden behind the facade of a man who had abused his power. As the tension still hung in the air, a murmur spread through the church when Thomas, Gerhanna's brother, entered through the back door. His expression was one of determination, and in his hands he held a folder full of documents. Silence fell instantly, and all eyes turned to him. Thomas, a man of average height but with a commanding presence, looked around, grasping the gravity of the situation. "I know what happened here," he said, his voice steady, though laden with emotion. "Hannah didn't deserve this. No one does." He stepped forward to the center of the room, where David and Clara stood beside Hannah, who was slowly recovering from the trauma. "I brought evidence that can help take that man down," he continued, gesturing towards Reverend Michael, who was being restrained by a few villagers. "Thomas, you shouldn't be here," Clara said, worried. "It's dangerous." "Dangerous? What could be more dangerous than letting that man go free?" Thomas retorted, looking directly at the Reverend, who was trying to wriggle free from the crowd. "He needs to be exposed. He will pay for everything he has done to my sister." David approached Thomas, sensing the urgency in his gaze. "What do you have?" he asked, ready to hear news that could change the course of the situation. Thomas opened the folder and began to display the documents, his hand trembling but resolute. "These are bank statements I managed to access. They show suspicious deposits and transactions that make no sense. The donation money didn't go where it was supposed to," he explained, while the villagers gathered closer, curious and eager to learn more. Murmurs of disbelief rippled through the crowd, and indignation began to swell. "How did you get this?" one of the men from the village asked incredulously. "I had my sources. I knew something was wrong with the church finances. And now, it all makes sense," Thomas replied, looking down at the documents with a mix of sadness and anger. The police finally arrived, and the officers quickly assessed the situation. The sergeant, a robust man with a serious expression, gestured for the Reverend to be quiet. "We received a report about suspicious activities. We need everyone to step back a bit," he ordered, as two officers approached the Reverend. "You can't do this. I'm a man of God," the Reverend shouted, desperation in his voice. "You have no evidence." "No evidence. Look around you," David shouted back, pointing at Thomas and his documents. "All of this will be investigated, and you will be held accountable for your actions." With the help of the villagers, the police managed to subdue the Reverend and handcuff him. The sergeant turned to the crowd, now in a frenzy of indignation. "We need all of you as witnesses. The evidence you've brought is very serious." As the community began to reorganize, the atmosphere of tension started to dissipate. The people who had been in shock began to unite, speaking quietly but with a renewed spirit of determination. David observed all of this, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew this moment would change the village forever. "I don't know how to thank you," Hannah said, now sitting with Clara's support, looking at David and Thomas. "You risked everything for me. You are our friend," David replied with an encouraging smile. "And no one deserves to go through what you did." Thomas looked at his sister, emotion brimming in his eyes. "We will rebuild this. St. Peter's Village will be a safe place again." With the Reverend's arrest and the evidence in hand, the police began to work swiftly to ensure justice was served. Meanwhile,